Planning to own a clothing store? You might want to think twice. Not because you shouldn't do it, it's because there's a real gap between what this looks like from the outside and what it actually costs. And that gap is exactly what this video is for. The pitch is appealing. Curate a space full of clothes you love, let a mall's foot traffic do your marketing for you, and get paid to have good taste. And the gross margins back that up on paper. A typical clothing store runs 50 to 65% gross margin, some of the healthiest markup of any business on this channel. But by the time that number reaches the owner's pocket, it's usually landed closer to 10% net. That's one of the widest gaps between markup and take-home on this entire channel. So what's eating the other 40 points on the way to the owner's bank account? That's what we're figuring out today. One quick note before the numbers start. Every figure in this video is real, sourced, and independently checked. But costs and regulations shift by state, city, and sometimes zip code. Treat these as your benchmark, not a quote for your specific address. The first cost, the one that starts before you've hung a single shirt, most mall units are empty shells, and turning one into an actual store is its own separate budget. Total startup capital for an independent clothing store typically runs $50,000 to $170,000, covering inventory, fixtures, point of sale, and initial marketing. Build-out is its own line item entirely. National average fit-out costs run around $149 per square foot, and that climbs sharply in expensive markets. On a modest 1,200 square foot mall unit, that's roughly $180,000 just to turn an empty shell into a working store, before a single garment arrives. Going the franchise route changes the math again. A licensed sports apparel concept can run $100,000 to $500,000 in total investment. A children's resale franchise can run $275,000 to $350,000. And franchise clothing retail owners average around $55,000 a year in personal income per store, once everything is accounted for. Whichever path you choose, the buy-in gets you an empty space with your name on the lease. The lease itself is where this business actually gets interesting. Even the square footage on the lease can be misleading. Some tenants pay rent on rentable square footage that's larger than the usable space they get to merchandise, a gap sometimes called a load factor, and it's worth confirming before you sign, not after you've measured the floor yourself. The hidden trap, the one written directly into most mall leases, the better you sell, the more rent you can owe. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual lease clause. Most mall leases include something called percentage rent. You pay your base rent, or a percentage of your gross sales, whichever is higher, once you cross a number called the natural breakpoint. Here's how that plays out with real numbers. Say your base rent is $60,000 a year, and your percentage rate is 5%. Your natural breakpoint is $1.2 million in sales. Sell $1.5 million in a strong year, and you owe percentage rent on the $300,000 overage. That's an extra $15,000 on top of the rent you already budgeted for, purely because business was good. Then there's common area maintenance, known as CAM. In a regional mall specifically, CAM commonly runs $8 to $14 per square foot per year, covering shared hallways, security, and the mall's own marketing. Two units with identical base rent can differ by $8 or more per square foot in CAM alone, right at the low end of that regional mall range, depending on the mall and the lease language. On a 4,250 square foot space, that gap alone is $34,000 a year. Over a 10-year lease, that's more than $340,000 that never showed up when you compared the base rent numbers. Add it all together, and total occupancy cost, rent plus CAM plus percentage rent, should stay within 6 to 10% of projected sales. Plenty of first-time tenants never run that calculation until the bills start arriving. CAM statements are also worth auditing, not just accepting. Landlords true up the estimate against real spending every year, and billing errors or misclassified capital projects are common enough that a careful review regularly pays for itself. The real engine, the one that separates a lease that works from one that quietly bleeds you, the winners aren't the stores with the highest sales. They're the ones who did the lease math before they signed anything. So if the markup is healthy, but the occupancy costs stack up fast, where does an owner actually protect their margin? At the negotiating table, before the lease is signed, not after. Experienced tenants negotiate caps on CAM increases every single year, rather than accepting an open-ended number the landlord can raise at will. That single negotiation can be worth tens of thousands of dollars across a 10-year term. They also calculate their own natural breakpoint before agreeing to a percentage rate, so a genuinely great sales year doesn't come with a rent surprise attached to it. And they protect that 50 to 65% gross margin obsessively, because clothing is a perishable product in its own way. A jacket that doesn't sell by the end of the season isn't worth what it was worth in October. Deep, frequent markdowns are how a healthy gross margin quietly becomes a thin one. The stores that hit that 10% net margin consistently are rarely the ones with the trendiest inventory. They're the ones that turn inventory fast enough that markdowns stay rare instead of routine. That means ordering conservatively enough that a slow style doesn't sit on a rack for 3 months, and being willing to clear it early at a smaller discount rather than letting it become a bigger one later in the season. The real money in clothing retail. The markup was never the problem. The lease and the markdown rack are where it disappears. Negotiate the first one and discipline the second, and that 50 to 65% gross margin actually has a chance of reaching your pocket. Run the real numbers on a mainstream mall store, and the gap becomes concrete. A store averaging a $40 sale price and around 1,250 transactions a month brings in roughly $50,000 in monthly revenue, $600,000 a year. At a 5% typical percentage rate, that store's natural breakpoint matters enormously. Cross it without having negotiated a cap, and a great year starts quietly funding the mall's budget as much as the owner's. Layer in a CAM bill that landed at the high end of that $8 to $14 range because nobody negotiated it down, and 2 stores doing identical sales numbers in the same mall can post completely different profit at the end of the year, for reasons that have nothing to do with merchandising, foot traffic, or how good the window display looked. That's not a hypothetical. That's the same lease clause sitting in most mall contracts, read closely by some tenants and skimmed past by others. The tenant who reads it closely walks into negotiations asking for a CAM cap and the clear breakpoint calculation. The tenant who skims it finds out what those clauses meant the first time a strong quarter triggers a bill nobody budgeted for. So let's run the 2 real outcomes. The optimistic case. You negotiate a CAM cap before signing, understand your natural breakpoint going in, and run tight inventory turns that keep markdowns rare. Total occupancy cost stays near that 6 to 10% target. On $600,000 in annual sales, net margin holds near 10%, putting roughly $60,000 in owner profit, a real and sustainable outcome for a single mall location. The realistic case. You sign the lease the mall hands you, uncapped CAM included, and don't calculate your breakpoint until a strong holiday season triggers a percentage rent bill you didn't budget for. Slow-moving inventory gets marked down aggressively just to clear space for the next season, quietly compressing that 50 to 65% gross margin down toward the low end. Net margin lands closer to 3 to 5%, and a busy store still ends the year with very little to show for it. Same mall, same foot traffic, same merchandise quality. The entire gap comes down to what got negotiated before the lease was signed, and how disciplined the markdown rack stayed all year. So is it worth it? If you're picturing the healthy markup on a shirt as your business model, that number was only ever half the story. What's true is that this remains an accessible retail business for someone who treats the lease negotiation and the inventory calendar as seriously as the merchandising itself. For someone willing to read the CAM clause line by line and track sell-through the way other owners on this channel track occupancy or turns per day, this can be a real, profitable small business. It rewards a specific discipline that has nothing to do with fashion sense. Reading a lease as carefully as a contract lawyer would, before it's the only copy you have to live with for the next 10 years. For someone signing the first lease offered and restocking on instinct, the mall and the markdown rack will quietly take the margin the shirt tag promised. Remember this: nobody gets rich on the markup. They get rich on what's left after the lease and the leftover inventory both take their cut. Read the lease first. The close were always the easy part.